Okay, we're going to take another look at the ovarian cycle, but now I'm going to go into some depth here. And we'll begin by looking at and examining the primary oocyte. The primary oocyte is found here in the center as shown here. Okay, so this is my oocyte. I'm going to outline it in black. And the oocyte nucleus, although that's actually deceptive, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and cross that out. Because really, remember that this oocyte is in metaphase. Okay, and so this is where a human, we'd have 23 of these chromosomes lined up. Okay, with our centrosomes and our spindle apparatus like so. Okay, like so. The surrounding cells are follicle cells. Okay, they're primordial follicle cells, and what we're going to look at them, and we're going to refer to them as granulosa cells. Now you'll notice that the term granulosa cells is being reused. Remember that we encountered granular cells or granulosa cells in the kidneys as well. The term granulosa simply refers to the fact that these are going to have little granules. Whoops, that's not going to help. Little tiny granules. Deet, deet, deet. All right, little tiny granules in here that are going to be about secreting, are going to be so that we can secrete those into the environment. And I'm going to talk about what those hold. Okay, what those are for. That's essentially where the term granulosa cells come from. There's things that secrete, cells that secrete substances. In the kidneys, those cells secrete renin. Here, we're going to have these granulosa cells that are going to secrete a hormone. Now, this is where our primary follicle sits. Remember, we started out with 7 million of those. At birth, we were down to about 2 million. And at puberty, we were down to about 500,000. And that's essentially what we've got there. So these granulosa cells surrounding that oocyte are there to protect it, but they're also the cells that are going to respond. These are the follicle cells that are going to respond to hormone. So what hormone are we dealing with? Well, actually, let me go back up here. These cells, cells before progression are going to just sit like this. And then when the hormone FSH comes along, and at first follicle stimulating hormone levels are low, but as this low level of FSH binds to receptors found on those granulosa cells, on those follicular cells, those cells are going to begin to develop. And they're also going to differentiate into first my granulosa cells, that's what they are in the center here. But also we're going to start getting the production or the development of these cells on the outer rim called theca cells. Okay. Now, the zona pellucida, and I'm not entirely sure I'm pronouncing that right, but bear with me. This is a protective layer that is actually going to remain with the oocyte even after ovulation. I don't want that big one. And so that is going to be found just right along this oocyte right there. Okay, and so that's the zona pellucida. Now, as these follicles begin to develop, as this follicular cell begins to develop, it is going to begin to secrete a very important hormone called estrogen. And that estrogen is going to target the uterine cells. Specifically, it's going to target the endometrial cells in the uterus. So let's make a quick note of that. Estrogen targets endometrial cells in the uterus. And what that estrogen is going to do is cause those endometrial cells to divide and proliferate. And so we're going to see a proliferation of the layer, the innermost layer of the uterus, in preparation of supporting a fetus should this particular oocyte become fertilized. Now, I also want to mention, okay, back here, this FSH, it's not going to just make one oocyte begin to develop. It's going to make several of them begin to go through the developmental process. And yet only one of them, and in rare cases maybe two, and even rare cases maybe three, will ovulate. For most of us, we only ovulate one oocyte at a time. If we ovulate more than one, we're at risk of having twins. But that's a relatively rare occurrence, all things considered. Because we have more than one follicle developing at a time, we get more estrogen. And as those follicles continue to mature, the level of estrogen increases. And so we begin to produce more and more and more estrogen as these follicles mature. So the follicle will mature from the primary follicle, which is what we see here, okay, primary follicle, to our secondary follicle, okay, and notice that the secondary has more layers of granulosa cells, and it's got that theca layer. And then from there, it's going to become a tertiary follicle. We're still going to be producing estrogen. In fact, we're going to produce a lot of estrogen, a lot more estrogen at this stage as these granulosa cells continue to pump out this estrogen. Okay. And now what we're going to see, so here's my granulosa cells. My zona pellucida is surrounding that oocyte. You can see a little bit more follicle cells surrounding that oocyte right here. Okay. And we've got our theca cells. Notice how those have also proliferated. And we have more of them out here. Okay. More of those out here. But now we're also going to get the filling. We're going to fill the innermost layer right here with fluid. Okay? That's going to be filled with fluid. And at first we only get a little bit of fluid. But gradually it's going to start to fill and fill and fill until essentially what we have happening is we're forming a little cyst. I'm actually going to flip up here. As this follicle forms, as this follicle develops, it'll begin to push up against the dominant follicle. Not every single one of them will make it to this stage, but the dominant follicle will begin to push here, and it'll actually start to push the cortex, the cells here out, and you get this little bulge or this cyst-like structure. And as we continue to fill with fluid, it's going to push further and further against that wall of the ovary until eventually we're going to reach a very large tertiary follicle known as the Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle. Okay. And that Graafian follicle puts so much pressure on the wall. You see this? This is the ovary wall here, or the cortex, the capsule. Okay. And it puts so much pressure on it that this cyst-like structure explodes. Kind of like a zit, right? You pop a zit and it explodes. That's what happens. It's exploding, and all of this liquid spills out with this explosive force, and the oocyte ovulate. This ovulation is forced outward, where it will enter into the fallopian tubes and will be propelled down the fallopian tubes into the uterus by the fimbriae, the flagella, or not the flagella, cilia that exist within the fallopian tubes. Fertilization typically takes place in the fallopian tubes. This would be the ovulation phase, right? This is ovulation. After ovulation, we're going to reach the luteal phase. But let me talk a little bit more about what triggers ovulation. You've seen the FSH. We talked about how FSH continues to bombard, and let's go ahead and draw some FSH in here. I'm going to switch colors here. FSH continues to bombard those granulosa cells, those follicle cells. And as FSH levels increase, the follicle matures. But now let's go over here. Now we get an FSH surge, but it's a relatively small compared to a surge of another very important hormone, and that is going to be, what color? We'll put it in purple. My LH. Okay? LH. When this tertiary follicle is large enough, when it's a Graafian follicle and it's ready to pop, LH hits those cells and prepares them for this explosion that occurs within about 24 hours after my LH surge. Now, the actual explosion that occurs is an inflammatory process. It does involve prostaglandins. Most women don't feel this, but there are some sensitive women who will actually feel a twinge that is associated with ovulation because of the inflammatory process, this prostaglandins. Now, we're going to proceed from there into the luteal stage, and what happens is these cells, okay, most of these cells, let me kind of highlight them all. These cells and the theca cells, okay, all of these cells are left behind, okay? And these cells convert into the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is going to specialize in the release of another very important hormone known as progesterone, or the pregnancy hormone. The job of this progesterone is to maintain the endometrial layer of the uterus so that it can promote the development of the embryo, the implantation of the embryo, the development of the embryo, until a placenta can be established. Now, if there is no implantation, then that corpus luteum will decay to produce the corpus albicans, which stops producing the progesterone. Let's back up a little bit. I should mention, as these theca cells develop, these start to produce just a little bit of progesterone. Not a lot. Most of the progesterone is going to be secreted later by the corpus luteum. But we do get just a teeny tiny amount of progesterone being produced to accompany the estrogen. And that is the ovarian cycle in a nutshell. Now, the ovarian cycle occurs at exactly the same time as what we're going to refer to as the uterine cycle. Together, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle make the menstrual cycle. You have to put the two of them together. We'll take a look at the uterine cycle in the next video.